Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it. I know you got a lot of things to choose from. I'm really excited to be here today and talk to you about privacy governance and explainability in ML or AI. So just real quickly, about myself. So I would be remiss not to first mention my wife, Michelle, who without whom I would not be here at all. And I'm a proud cat dad, so I have 3 kitties, Velvet, Lacey, and Ginger. So if you see mistypes, half the time it's me, half the time it's them walking on the keyboard. Interest list, obviously data privacy, it's what we're here to talk about. Analytics and process design. I really love merging the softer and skill side of things to the technical side, being that kind of bridge between the technical challenges that we're dealing with today and the processes that we have to put in place to make those possible to handle. And my why. So I am a solution architect at Slalom Consulting, and one of the really important things about Slalom is that it's important we identify our why. Why are we here? Why are we doing what we're doing? And my coworkers will tell you that I incessantly want to embed privacy into everyday processes. I don't care how much you deal with, how big the organization is. I want to do it because I truly believe that data privacy is going to continue to be a cornerstone of businesses and their competitive advantage. But then also from a risk perspective, when you're mitigating risk, you can put a lot of overhead in the process. You can put a lot of steps that are unnecessary to try and get things perfect. How can we do it in a way that doesn't stifle innovation, but it still minimizes that risk? I also have the honor of being able to lecture at UC Berkeley in human rights and values and data, and consult with good research as well in the privacy space. Before that, I was at UMSL for my undergraduate in accounting, believe it or not, and charter communications and Boeing prior work experience. So lots of highly regulated areas, lots of very different regulations. So it made me love the compliance side, whether I liked it or not. So today's entertainment. So first I'm going to walk you through a brief evolution of data privacy. Who here knows what data privacy is? Hopefully a good amount of you. Awesome. Well, I'm going to try and breeze through it. I just didn't want to make any assumptions about the level of detail here, but it's important to get that. Then we're going to talk about trust, context, and privacy by design, why those matter. And then we're going to get into the real reason that we're doing this, and that's to talk about the unique challenges that live within machine learning problems, and then the methods that we can use for both discovering that privacy risk and then what can we do about mitigating it. I'll say that by no means am I going to be able to run through every possible method. I'm going to dip into a few, but would love to continue this conversation after and beyond. All right, so brief evolution, data privacy. Why does it matter? These are great companies up here. I by no means show these companies because they have any material weaknesses or problems that need to be called out. It's really to show that even the best of businesses can have mistakes in their processes. Some are data breaches, some are just privacy violations. The majority of data breaches, believe it or not, are actually well-intended people who make a mistake. So it's not like we're just trying to do security and keep people from breaching our systems. That is needed. But also what we're doing is trying to make sure that we're using data the way that we say we are, that we're being transparent, communicating with consumers about that, and that we carry that through in everything, not just what we think is the most important decision, but every decision that gets made throughout the consumer life cycle. So real briefly here, this is just looking at the US, of course, but I wanted to cover the landscape of privacy risk. This is just looking at 2018, believe it or not. 13 different states in the US actually implemented new policies around data privacy. More than 40 actually introduced new legislation. And then one for the federal level as well, which, believe it or not, companies are finally crying for. Who here knows GDPR, the EU? Awesome, love it, thank you. It is, of course, the cornerstone. It's what California is trying to mimic, some level of success, but it's keeping global companies that may be based in the US from acting like they're just in the US. So now that it's coming stateside, it's actually bringing things together, and it's helping make that argument for holistic compliance. National regulations, talked about the US, but of course we have to worry about all the other different things that nations have. Some nations have put in data residency or data sovereignty requirements. Thou shalt not send my data across borders without permission. And that's changing how companies need to think about hosting data, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud. How can they keep things within that border, and what does that mean to how they implement things? States we've kind of already talked about. California is leading the way, but you've got New York, Vermont, Nevada, Colorado. They're just coming. They're coming with more, and they're coming with different pieces because every state wants to be a little bit special, but they all have very common attributes about them. And then industry regulations. There's a great deal of overlap in privacy with things like HIPAA or PCI, your payment card information, things like that. It's not just, hey, am I compliant with GDPR? It's, do I have a holistic privacy model that allows me to deal with these things? And once you get to machine learning, it becomes even more complicated because the amount of moving parts that you have to deal with and the amount of things that you can very succinctly define get less and less as you go forward. So just an idea of perspectives on privacy. One thing that I really want to debunk is that privacy is not just about security. Privacy is about both trying to prevent the unauthorized use of data, but also how you govern the authorized use of it. So it's the entire data life cycle. It's everything from the point at which you communicate with the consumer and say, hey, would you like a quote? Please provide your email and your name, and we'll be happy to service you. Through to the end of when you're done, they say, I don't want to be a customer anymore. Hopefully it's 40 years later and they just don't need the service. And then what do you do with their data and everything in between? The life cycle cannot be ignored. So privacy doesn't start or stop at any individual point until that person is no longer a consumer that you're even targeting, let alone serving. So thinking about what these regulations have actually given us the right to do. So fundamental right to privacy doesn't just mean that you have the right to have things be private. It also means you have the right to know what isn't private and why. Why is that? You need to be able to have the autonomy to make decisions, right? I can go into a store and I can choose to buy something, but do I know if someone's using my personal data right now to refine an algorithm that can target people for something? It's very important that we're able to do that. So these new regulations get us the ability to ask several questions. What data are you collecting? This is, of course, all of these are new with the advent of data privacy. We used to be able to go out and scrape whatever we wanted, and as long as we weren't infringing upon patents or trademarks or copyrights, it was okay. It was public. We got it from somewhere, right? So we can use it. No, not anymore. You have to be very specific about why you're collecting it and what you're collecting. And then once you collect it, how are you using that data? Consumers have the right to know, one, through privacy policies. You have to proactively tell consumers what you're doing and how you're protecting their data. Because it's not just are you okay with it? Okay, you're okay with it. I'll take it and do whatever I want now. No, it's an ongoing life cycle. So if there's a change in business purpose along the way, then they actually have to be made aware of that so that they can then make that decision, oh, you collected my data for this transaction, but now you want to profile and target me? I don't know if I'm okay with that. Data privacy actually gives consumers the right to make that claim, and you have to proactively let them know they have those rights. So while I might have data in a database and I want to go and profile things, I actually have to be very careful about whether or not that's within the business purpose, that consumer said, yeah, sure, you can use my age and my weight. How long are you keeping my data? I lose track of how many times folks say data retention. I keep it forever, right? It's my data. You gave it to me. I keep it forever. That's not okay anymore. You can't just hide behind, I know I don't have a use for it today, but I might in the future. If you don't have a reason to have that data, you shouldn't have it. And now regulators are finally getting in the middle of that and saying, okay, prove to us that you said I can keep it for this long. Prove to us why that's reasonable, and then show me that you're doing it. Will you delete my data if I ask? This is the right to be forgotten or the right to erasure in GDPR, but it also is pervasive in California. If I find out that you have personal information that you don't need through business or legal purposes, and I am a resident in one of those areas, I have the right to say, you know what, delete that personal information, you don't need it anymore. And you have to do it. You have to do it within a reasonable amount of time. It doesn't have to be like that, but you have to do that. And you can do it through one of two ways. You can either actually delete it, or you can anonymize that data. And by anonymize, I really mean it can no longer be tagged to you as an individual. You might be a record with a handful of fields that get retained, but it's now been reasonably impossible to link that back to you as a person, so that if all of that record were to be released, it wouldn't be manageable for a bad agent to apply that back to you. And then what will you do if my data is stolen? Data breach has become a large thing. And I know because Equifax really actually hit me hard, and I had some folks try and set up loans for houses after that breach in my name, so that was fun. But as a result of that, that really made it keen to me as to what businesses should have to do whenever there is a breach. What got stolen? What could be used? How do you know? What are you going to tell me? Is there a way for me to figure out? Do I just have to wait until I get an alert that says a new car loan's been opened in your name? Or what kind of comfort can I get? Because right now, I'm losing trust as a consumer, and I'm feeling like you're not upholding these things. So you have to have very specific incident response processes defined, and then you have to have those breach notifications defined as well. Because as I mentioned before, the consumer relationship is the entire life cycle of the data. It's from the point at which you solicit that data to the point at which you no longer have it, and everything in between. So if something bad happens, it doesn't change that relationship. You still have to do things. There's still a bar that you have to get to. So, trust, context, and privacy by design. I'll try to stay off my high horse here, but I love this. So first and foremost, transparency and consumer trust. These are not buzzwords. These are not little cute words. They're very important right now. Consumer data, yes, it's an asset. It's an asset to every business. And if they're not treating it that way, they need to, because they're losing money as a result. But it can very easily become a liability. All you need to do is take it for granted. Something bad happens. I don't update my security. I use some information and then it accidentally gets posted to a public GitHub repo. All kinds of mistakes can happen. I have it on an unsecured AWS database, and now there's 400 million addresses and phone numbers out there. All kinds of things can happen. And it takes having an actual holistic process in place to protect that asset so that it doesn't become a liability, because it can very quickly. Consumers want to know how their data is being monetized. I think everybody in this room wants to know, when you provide your name and your age and your bank account, if that company is making money off of that, right? They always say, well, if the product is free, then you're the product. Well, wouldn't you like to know how you're the product? I mean, Google makes a lot of money. A lot of these online companies make a lot of money. Would you like to know if you're being victimized or if you're being given a cost benefit that you're comfortable with? Thanks to data privacy, now that's actually becoming part of the conversation. And trust is not a one-time transaction. I mentioned this already. It's not the point at which you say, I accept, and then they have no obligation to you anymore. They've agreed to things and you've agreed to things. As long as they have your data, until they can prove they no longer do, they have to support you as a consumer because they have that data and it's an asset that you've given them for specific purposes. Power dynamics are constantly changing. So back even in my college days, I would have thought about what would happen if I left Facebook just because maybe I didn't agree with what they were doing. Think about what that would have meant. That would have meant abandoning my entire social group. There's a great power dynamic there that company could have done whatever they wanted to do, and the harm to me to actually act on it would have been so significant that bar of what they can do got higher and higher because I can't leave my social group. But now that things are changing, there's more tools, there's more technology, there's more ways for us to communicate, for example, just using social media as the example. Those power dynamics are starting to shift because there's not one platform that has control over everything. Yes, companies can purchase other platforms and they end up getting some. But now there are other ways for us to communicate. So those power dynamics shifting is giving consumers more muscle to say, hey, when I cancel or when I delete my account, it means something to you now. It goes to your bottom line. And I'm not 1 out of 6 billion and it's going to be a drop in the bucket. Now with power dynamics shifting, we have more control, and data privacy laws help amplify that. A really important piece that I want to make sure everybody leaves with is that carrying the voice of the consumer through your process, again, is not a buzz term. It's actually something tangible that you can see as a company. So when you actually take something that the customer needs and you prioritize that over what you would do for the competitive advantage of your business, you say, fundamental right to privacy, these are these processes. It's not just for compliance. It's not just because I don't want to get fined. It's because I'm a consumer of this company and this is how I would want to be treated. That's carrying the voice of the consumer. So when you carry those things through, it's actually incredibly important because it echoes your business's values. It echoes who you are as a company as well as who you are as people and coworkers. And then it starts to give that visibility in, because in order to make it that transparent, in order to present that awareness, you actually have to give consumers visibility into what you're doing. Yes, you're not going to give away all your trade secrets, but at the same time, by opening the window a little bit and saying, here's how we're using your data, here's what I'm doing with it, this is how I monetize it. If I share it with a third party, why? What do they have to do? Do they have to protect it, or am I giving it to them with absolute immunity? These are not trivial questions. They're incredibly important, and they're actually easy for companies to answer. And now that companies have started answering those questions, it's become the price to come to the table. And most importantly, making it easy for the consumers cannot be overstated. There are a lot of ways that you can try and control privacy settings. There are a lot of really complex ways that you can try and do it. The harder it is for a consumer to understand what those settings are, whether by default or what they have control over, the less they're going to trust. So you can create all kinds of tools, but unless it's easy for me as a user and intuitive for me to go in and say, oh, okay, this is where I go if I don't want you to sell my information to a third party. If I know how to go there and it's a good user experience, I'm innately going to trust you as a company because I believe that you're thinking about me more than just how do I get that dollar. You're thinking about how I keep them as a consumer going forward, even if there's not a dollar in it for me. That dollar was in it when I got the dollar from you up front. Now I'm protecting that and showing you what it means for you to be a consumer of this company. So contextual integrity, Helen Niesenbaum theorized this idea, and it sounds very simple, but it's actually incredibly powerful and continues to accelerate as time moves forward. Privacy is 100% context-based. I have a few nice images here. Who would give me their social security number? Yeah, that's what I thought. So 20 years ago, it probably would have been the same amount of hands, a big old goose egg. But maybe who would have given me a retinal scan 10 years ago? I guarantee it's a non-zero amount because we didn't know what you could do with that, right? There weren't a lot of technologies that used your retinal scan. Now there are, of course. I can get into my phone with a facial recognition. I can get into my phone with my fingerprint. These things are important now. But 10, 15, 20 years ago, you probably would have given it to me without thinking about it because we didn't know how those things could be used to harm us. So Helen Niesenbaum looks at this from the perspective of informational norms of appropriateness and flow. So she thinks about it in the context of how is this appropriate or not appropriate based on cultural norms and social norms. And then how is that flowing? How is that distributed across the community? Is it evenly distributed? Is it unevenly distributed? Is it something that is so difficult that that harm can't come to many people until a lot of time has passed? So these ideas of appropriateness and flow help guide whether or not we consider something bad. If someone were to come in here and steal my wallet, man, cultural norms say that's theft. Thankfully, laws say that's theft. But if someone were to come in here and look at me and take a picture, now I will give a shout out to Strangeloop because they give the lanyard colors. You get to say whether you get a picture. That's awesome. But if someone were to come in here and take a picture of me, would I immediately say, man, I've been harmed right now? It's because of the context around that. What do I know now? Can someone use that picture to get into my phone? Ooh, maybe there is harm there. Is someone going to post that online and say that I'm a spokesperson for vaping products? Okay, this is really weird. I don't know why you'd choose me for that, but that's fine. So the context is incredibly important, and it changes over time. So privacy by design, it is exactly as it sounds. It is about taking privacy and building it into your design process. Yeah, that's what the words are. Thanks, Jared. It's actually a little bit harder to do in practice because a lot of folks don't want to. It slows down the agile development process. But this was theorized by Ann Cavoukian out of the Ontario Commissioner's Office years and years ago, and it still is really highlighted today, and of course is Article 25 of GDPR, so it will continue to be a pervasive topic. The central tenets of it are pretty simple. There are 7. There's an 8th. There's an asterisk next to it because I selfishly added it, but we'll get there. So first, proactive, not reactive. When I do something by design, it is not after I'm done designing it. It's when it's part of the process. It has to be part of the process. Privacy as a default setting. You hear a lot of conversations around defaults. When I create an account, are they going to send me notifications by default? Probably, but do you think about that? Do the companies think, what would the user want? Privacy has to be a default setting. It can't be, I'm going to sell your information until you go to this hidden thing and tell me not to anymore. That's a deceptive practice, so it has to be a default. Privacy embedded into design, kind of already talked about that. It has to be as you're planting the plant, not after the plant's grown and then you just sprinkle it with some fertilizer. It's positive sum, it's not zero sum. With data privacy, you'll hear a lot of talk about fines. Man, GDPR, they're gonna hit me with 4% of my annual turnover. Yes, that's a huge amount, but when's that actually going to hit? It's gonna be in litigation for years? No. It's actually also the court of public opinion. How is the stock gonna be influenced? How are consumers gonna react to those things? How are employees gonna react to those things when they realize things are happening this way? It is not zero sum. Full life cycle protection. I've talked about how it's from the point at which you request data to the point at which you no longer have it. It has to be the full life cycle, and privacy by design helps make sure that that was built in from the get-go. Visibility and transparency we've already hit on pretty hard, but it really makes it easy for you to define for consumers as well as for regulators how you're handling privacy risk. If you're already talking about it, you're already defining it up front, you don't have to go back and say, man, are we doing data retention? Oh man, do I keep that for 10 years? Oh wow, I use that in that product? I didn't, oh, that's in clear text? These are questions that shouldn't come up after the fact, it's before. Respect for user privacy. Clearly, by showing that you care enough to build these things in, it's not just a compliance matter, it's about building consumer trust, then you're actually showing users that you respect their privacy, you respect their rights, not just what the law says you have to do. I respect that my consumers are intelligent enough to have wants and needs, and I respect them enough to give them and develop those options for them to make those choices. And then my selfish ad, sustainable and repeatable. I'm a broken record about this because I really think it's the missing link. When you do this by design, it becomes your recurring process. It's not a special, wow, this is a really high-risk data set, maybe I should do it this time. It becomes your standard operating procedure, and it becomes so much easier because you're not doing it just because an audit's coming up. You're not doing it just because a breach happened. You're doing it because it's part of what your core business processes are. And then just one quick relationship that we've seen. Governance and data optimization maturity, they always go hand in hand. I am yet to see a client or a company in which the governance is incredibly mature, but the optimization of their data and organization of that data is not mature. They tend to go hand in hand because in order to govern and in order to use things in an optimized manner, you actually have to understand what you have, where it is, who has access, how you're using it, how you're holding it, and how long you're holding it. If you can answer that long list of questions, then your ability to optimize that data and use it to its fullest extent is more likely. We cannot practice privacy by design in retrospect. I've seen so many companies try. You just can't. Privacy by design has to be up front. If you try and do it in reverse, not only is it going to be 10 times more expensive, it's going to be 10 times more difficult because you're trying to go back into prior processes and figure out, man, I wasn't looking for this. Who's going to know if I do this? If you define these things up front, you've already got them documented. You already have SMEs who are thinking about it. You already have your products defined to be able to handle these. If you realize that you're not doing something, well, we're doing this in the other products. So it's easy for us to figure out what the fix is. We're not doing something for the first time because someone came, knocked on the door and said, what's your data retention right now? So I really hope that one big takeaway from this is the role that developers, analysts, and architects play. Because right now, the current state of privacy is not being guided by the folks in this room. And that's a problem for me. That's a big problem for me. The legal department should not be telling you what you need to build. The legal department should be confirming for you that what you're building is good. And then if it's not, helping you to figure that out. I spend a lot of my days trying to bridge the gap between legal and between the technical side, which basically just speak Latin and pig Latin maybe. It doesn't go comfortably. So bridging that gap between them helps take that responsibility and that burden and move it over to the right people. What are some things that are being done today? Because privacy is impacting organizations regardless of their size. There are a lot of different approaches. None of them are one size fits all, of course. You have centralized privacy offices that are really trying to govern things at a holistic enterprise level, and that's great. PIAs or DPIAs, these are privacy impact assessments or data protection impact assessments. That's having these compliance folks who understand the laws going in and saying, I'm going to look at your process, I'm going to look at what data you use, and I'm going to try and define what risk you have. But again, that's generally done by another party, not by the developers who are getting ready to build something. Data minimization and masking. So if you don't need something, don't take it. I can't stress that enough. And I've actually had people look at me and go, no. I ran it by legal. They're good with it. So would you be willing to show me a lawyer that says, yes, please take Social Security numbers when you have no reasonable business purpose to do so? That's never going to happen. Thankfully, that's never going to happen, at least not out loud. We've got bias detection, so looking at things on the back end. How am I treating different populations? Am I underrepresenting, overrepresenting? How can I detect that? It's generally retrospective in implementation right now, but it's happening. Secure processing, you'll hear things about homomorphic encryption, you'll hear things about differential privacy, I'll talk briefly about in a bit. There are new things coming out. We are looking at it the right way. Protection is definitely part of privacy, but it's not the only piece of privacy. Legal and the regulators, that just sounded like an awesome name for a band. So these parties are still really owning a lot of these things. When you go in, a new law comes out, you have lawyers coming to you and saying, okay, we got to do it for this process, we got to do it for that product. Oh yeah, we got some people, we got some employees that are over there in that jurisdiction. Okay, we got to do it for that one too. Go. And you say, how am I supposed to do that? Not my job. I'm just supposed to tell you what to do, not how to do it. And then there's just a ball that gets dropped right there. So there's a lot of that happening right now. And then trust centers. So I actually had the privilege to cooperate on some work here with trust centers. A colleague of mine is doing a lot of work with Cisco, and that's the picture you see to the right, creating data sheets and data maps. So it's starting to take data flows and take them down from a really specific network topology level and bringing it down to a digestible for your average consumer to be able to understand and know how that impacts their risk. Where does my PII go? Where does it terminate? Where does my non-PII go? These sorts of things are important and they're useful. There is no panacea. There is not. I wish there were. That'd be great. It might not be for job security, but it would be great for businesses everywhere. But the really important thing to think about is that companies are breaking new ground. And as they break new ground, they're building an inventory of tools that we can use. And the more tools and the more processes that you put in place to guard different ways, the better off consumers will be. We'll talk about those. So getting to machine learning and AI, it's incredibly unique for reasons that I'm sure everyone is here in this room for. It might be simple for me to say, Jared, can you define for me the logic in whether or not that person gets an email? It's probably pretty simple, right? It's just a rule. But if I say, hey, so that machine learning algorithm, can you define exactly how it gave me that upper and lower bound? Why did that person not get covered in insurance? Because that was their risk score? Now we're getting a little dicier. And one, I don't know if I can answer that. And two, am I allowed to answer that? Can I peel back the curtain and show people that information? How would I even do that? What decision tree in this random forest algorithm made that decision that kicked it over the edge and said that person's not insurable? These are really difficult questions to answer. So talked about the complexity in algorithmic and logical methods. The moment of decision making is very, very important for regulators, but it's also one of the hardest things to pinpoint when it comes to detailed and in-depth machine learning and deep learning. So it is much easier said than done. Algorithmic fairness. So the FTC Act, Section 5, talks about unfair and deceptive acts, but it doesn't look at it through the context of my machine learning model made that choice. I didn't look at that guy and see, oh man, I hate his t-shirt. I don't want to cover him. It's not something like that. It's not that easy. So identifying what was unfair, what was deceptive can be an incredibly difficult process and even more incredibly difficult to prosecute. And then distinct risks between algorithmic fairness and the use of algorithms. So just because my algorithm might be fair, it might not mistreat an underrepresented population, maybe the person who gets the results does something with that, and they interpret the output in a different way than was intended. So you've got two sides to bias. You've got the bias in the algorithm, and you've got the bias in the output of that algorithm and the use of that algorithm. And bias, I mentioned before, it can be unintentional, it can be intentional. Sometimes we think we know domain knowledge very well, and we encode things that may have had our own personal bias nested in it. Maybe I think guys named Jared aren't worth loans. I don't know, maybe I've had bad experiences with guys that have the same name as me, and I just don't want that guy to get a loan anymore. Wouldn't be great for me, but it also brings in a really weird bias that shouldn't be there. But even if I have the best of intentions, man, most of the people I know named Jared, they do not pay their loans back. That's not great. It's anecdotal evidence. It's real cute. But then on top of that, with machine learning and AI, it's learning from itself. It's going to perpetuate that bias systemically. So it might have just been one person said something and made a decision, but then it got perpetuated as part of that model going forward. And it might not be silly, your name is Jared, but it might be something that's much more harmful. And then that balance between competitive advantage and transparency. We want to tell consumers what's happening to the extent that we can, but we also can't peel back everything because then we're going to let our competitors know exactly what logic we're using. So it's a really, really tight balance between those two things. So the role of developers and engineers. Domain knowledge is critical. When I've seen legal departments or privacy offices try and define risk, they often say, can I get the people who built the product in the room? Because I can read the law, but I don't know how they coded it. I don't know what logic is going into it. And that's a really important thing. It's not the legal department's job to know that, but it's incredibly important. No one is going to be able to give the input that you as engineers and developers can, because you know the logic of what you're building. No one will know your thinking like you can. And that sounds so silly, but when you think about trying to diagnose privacy risk in retrospect, going back and getting in the head of the developer who built that algorithm is so difficult, let alone trying to go back to the developer and say, what were you thinking when you did that? Why did you do that way? I don't know, I was on a 26-hour workday and a lot of coffee. I have no idea. So doing these up front through design is incredibly important, and having it be the people that are in this room who do those things, who can actually answer those questions innately with the domain knowledge is incredibly important. And then building new methods. Who's going to build them? Find something that works? Great. People in this room are going to build them. So I can't impress upon you enough the importance of developers and engineers here. So I'm going to talk real briefly about some methods for this. So I'm not going to be able to cover everything or even to the level of degree that I'd like to, but I wanted to really highlight how you can look at risk from different perspectives. You've got seeking out risk in your data. So I can look at the data and I can try and figure out where identifiability becomes easier. Talk about those a little bit. Seeking out risk in processing, I can either look for bias in my algorithms, or maybe I can look at how I release that information and innate differential privacy. That list could be pages and pages long, but you guys don't have a pillow enough for that one, so we're gonna try and go through those quickly. And then seeking out risk in development. This one is one I'm really passionate about because I think this is how you get to the by design part. This is where you get the qualitative and the quantitative up front, and you define it, you document it, so that then I don't need to go into your head later. I know what you were thinking. I know what data is being used. I know what the logic is. I know what the outcomes are. So we'll talk a little bit about some methods for that. So real quickly, in order to do the few risk in your data approaches, wanted to look at the different types of data that we deal with. So of course you've got your PII, your personally identifiable information, full name, social security number. I have that, I know who you are. Those are very simple. Then you've got your quasi-identifiable information in orange there, your age, your gender, your zip code. Your age doesn't give me who you are, but if I get your age and your gender and your zip and maybe a couple other things, I can probably get pretty close to you, maybe 1 out of 5. And once we're at 1 out of 5, you probably don't feel safe anymore. So once you're getting there, you call it quasi-identifiable. I can combine it with other things to get to you. Non-identifiable information, I will caveat this by saying it depends on the data set. So we've got country here. Let's just imagine that this is a data set of 1,000 people from the US. It's not identifiable. There's nothing different about this data set. Yes, if there was one person who was from Laos and I knew that they worked at this company where the data set was, then maybe it fits. And then 4, sensitive information, be it for other regulatory issues, be it because of health or because of legal or religious. These are things that really need to be protected. So different methods here. So anonymity, diversity, and closeness, they're all very interconnected. They all built off of one another. None of them are perfect. They're all labor intensive. But they're ways to look at risk in your data and try and cleanse it a little bit so that you can at least reduce the attack surface, so to speak. So K-anonymity is saying, I want to make sure that my data set has at least K records of a certain group. I don't want this data set to have such a rare medical condition that only one person in the world has it, and if I show that medical condition, I know exactly who that person is. That's an obscure example, but it really looks at how you need to make sure that there is at least enough of a representative population that you're not giving a record away, that releasing that data doesn't become easily identifiable for a person. You can do that through suppressing data. If you find out fields are that way, you can do it through grouping and generalization. So instead of saying 102 years old, you can just say greater than 80 years old. You can group things together to reduce that risk. But there are still weaknesses: homogeneity attacks, background knowledge attacks, knowing about the data. Income diversity. So L diversity, it's an extension of this. It really says, look at the equivalence groups amongst my quasi-identifiable information. If I group all the people with the same age, gender, and zip code, how different are they? Do I have many of them? Do I have 2 of them? Do I have 20 of them with this one medical condition, 1 with the other medical condition? What is the diversity looking like? Maybe I need to remove records because someone's privacy is going to be at risk. It would be the same basic process, but you get to work against attribute inference there. And weaknesses, so it's very complex. You're going to have to look at every single group of QI and then compare it to your other information, which can be very difficult. And then moving to closeness, which is again a further extension of this. It's looking at how does the distribution of my data look versus the global distribution. So if I cleanse my data throughout, I say, oh man, I'm just going to take out everyone that's female. Well, great. The global distribution of other identifiable or sensitive variables probably just changed because I just completely changed the population. So now someone who wants to look at that data set can now attack it and know you've introduced some change, here's how it is. I can reverse engineer it. So these are not perfect, but they help build up the wall. So now a couple ways to actually look at model prediction risk. So adversarial training is one. This is actually a way of saying, let's combine competing tasks. Say I've got something I want to predict Y, and then something I don't want to be used, Z. Let's say I don't want to discriminate based on race. I can make race this thing that I don't want to predict. I want my model to ignore it. I want my model to look for when I'm trying and stop. Adversarial training is a way for us to do this. So you can actually prevent the recovery of that sensitive attribute because as you go and predict things, there's actually a negative gradient being provided back as a signal through your algorithm that says, I'm going to look for this and I'm going to not decide based on it, even if I see a correlation here. So it really, in the contrapositive, will also prevent someone from saying, oh, there's a lack of this Z thing here, so then my model must not be dependent upon it. So I highly recommend for examples of code here. I'd love to walk through every line, but I don't have that kind of time. AI Fairness 360, it's fantastic. It looks at adversarial training and so much more in terms of different algorithms for seeking out bias, but this is just one popular example. Dynamic upsampling through VAE. So VAE referring to variational autoencoders. This one is actually great because it doesn't require you to know what those sensitive attributes are. What's happening here is that by using this encoder, it's actually looking for latent representations in what your model is defining as it trains. So then as it's training, it can look and see, oh wow, it's really pinging on race here. I'm gonna pump data back in to tell it to stop looking at that, or to look at it less, to weight it less. So I can actually have my model train itself to look for things that it's impinging on and stop doing it so much. So that's really interesting because you don't have to define what that column is. It's going to look and see where the latent representations are. So it really prevents the amplification of bias because once you ping on that field, you can ping on it again and again and again, and then the model learns from that and it keeps doing it. So if you want to stop doing that, this is one way to approach that. developed by a team at MIT and Harvard. It's actually very cutting edge. The only code that you'll find for it is actually in some MIT deep learning labs. I highly encourage you go out. Got a link here in the presentation, happy to provide to anyone. It is open source. Finally, differential privacy. So really was formalized mathematically by Cynthia Dwork and a team of researchers to understand how I create epsilon differential privacy. What the heck does that mean? That means how do I get some kind of certainty that you can't identify an individual? Well, how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to pump random noise into what I give you back. So let's say you come to me and you say, I'm going to put in an epsilon value of 0.25, and I want to know what the mean grade is for girls between 14 and 16 in Missouri. Okay, well, I don't need to give you the data set of all those protected folks. I can actually pump some random noise in there, and it's going to be controlled, so I know exactly how much noise I'm putting in there, so that I can give you a useful upper and lower bound. So you don't actually have to see all that data. You actually ask a question. You have a limited amount of queries you can send, so you can't just brute force attack it. But I can give you an answer back that is both statistically useful and doesn't give you information about individuals. So I can learn about a population in generalities in a way that's statistically useful, but I don't have to know that Jared is a male who lives in St. Louis. I don't have to know those things because I can learn in other ways. So there is some great code. Google really is leading the way in this. They actually released and open sourced some of their differential privacy code. Highly recommend you go and look at it. It's incredibly intuitive, very insightful, and it's really spreading that message that the more we do this, the more this becomes standard operating procedure, the better off consumers will be. So now we're getting into the qualitative piece. First, I'm going to talk about model cards for model reporting. Model cards is something that was created by researchers at Google and in tandem with University of Toronto. It's a mechanism for gaining insight into the models as they're being designed and then as they're being tested. So it looks at things like model details, what's the intended use, what are the factors, the metrics, the ethical considerations, the caveats and recommendations to those things. So you can actually get a profile of what's happening in that model instead of just saying, here's a model, it's in this folder over here, we run it every week, and I give some data to this group who then processes it and makes decisions. We can actually have this so that when auditors come and say, what is this model doing, how is it doing it? We already have that. We can actually provide this context. I don't have to go back into the mind of the developer. You can do that now. And then lastly, multidimensional privacy analytic. So this was created by Deirdre Mulligan and a team of researchers out of UC Berkeley. And I love this as an add-on to model cards because what it actually does is it takes the qualitative data and makes it important. It breaks out privacy into different dimensions, so you can think about it as what's the theory behind it? What is the privacy that's being protected? Who is being protected? Why? By what are they being protected? And then you can think about harm. Ultimately, this is about quantifying harm. How do I figure out where it is, and how do I help prevent it? So by mashing together model reporting cards and the privacy analytic, you can get both a qualitative and a quantitative look at what you're doing, which is incredibly important. So if you think about this, we've talked about a lot of different methods. I want you to see this as a life cycle. And if I could make this circular with as many words, I would have, because it really needs to be iterative, just like the agile development process is. You need to be able to do this in a way that's not going to take you 6 hours every week. It has to be something you can do during story grooming or during a retro. It has to be something that you can answer quickly and efficiently without slowing you down. So you prioritize the risk assessments. You implement the privacy risk mitigation in your data. You look at where risk resides in your data. You utilize the tools that we've talked about to root out bias or to minimize the amount of information that you share in answering queries. You get key feedback from your stakeholders. Talk to the business, talk to ML knowledgeable folks, talk to engineers who actually built the application that is using that algorithm so that they understand what decisions are being made and how and when, and then visualize that potential harm and model it. You model it using these cards, you look at it from both a qualitative and a quantitative perspective, it's going to be incredibly powerful, and you're going to be able to have a very clear message, not just for regulators, but for consumers in how you address these things. So this is just really a lot of words for us to re-explain that, but the piece I want to get through is that the folks in this room are the ones best suited to do this. Right now, they're being done by folks who need your help, and it has to involve developers, engineers, and data scientists, because without that, we don't get the kind of insights into what we're thinking when we define these algorithms, or what we're thinking when we include this data and exclude that data. It's incredibly important for us to keep this context, because without that context, we can't clearly define the risk. Thank you very much.